Good morning again. Several months ago, Mike Newman, my good friend, standing right here, said he had a good friend, Andy Palec, standing right here. He has a very interesting story about his dad surviving the Holocaust. So we thought, wow, what a great idea for a forum. So here we are this morning. And I just want you to know that the forum committee does not by itself come up with all these great speakers. It's people like Mike who come up with ideas and tell us about them. So if any of you have ideas about forums, please talk to me or Mark or George or anybody on the forum committee. And if you'd like to be on the forum committee, you're welcome to join us. It's not one of those groups that meets every week. Just 2 times a year, the forum committee meets. So feel free to join us if you would like to. So with that, I'm going to let Mike introduce Andy.
I'll be quick. Good morning. I'm super excited to again hear the story of Samuel Palec. I've seen this presentation before, and the first time I saw it, I thought it was like something out of a movie. Just the incredible adventure, and a tragic and terrifying adventure that his dad went through, but managed to survive from Dachau. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Andy.
So the most important and impactful event of my entire life happened before I was born. 12 years before I was born, in a place called Dachau, near Munich, in southern Germany. Samuel Palec, in 1945, walked out of Dachau, a free man, after spending 1,400 days, for almost 4 years in the grips of terror, of Nazi terror in Europe. This is his story, but it's also my story. So let me start when I was a kid. We grew up in the northwest side of Milwaukee, and we really felt no different than anybody else in our neighborhood, our community. We knew we were Jews. We knew we were a minority. There were, maybe a handful of Jewish families on the northwest side that we knew, and almost everybody else was Christian, whether it's Catholic, Protestant, Methodist. But we all grew up together. We all had pretty much the same lives. We never thought there was a whole lot of difference between any of us. But there was one thing unusual, though, about our family, and that was that every family event, every interaction regarding family was always with someone from my mother's side of the family. There was nobody on my dad's side of the family. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no grandparents, great-grandparents. I knew pretty young, that my dad was a survivor of the Holocaust, that he was a refugee and had come to the United States. I didn't realize everything that happened to him until I was much later, probably in high school, actually a little bit younger than that, probably junior high school, when I really started to understand. Everything we did was on my mother's side of the family, so it was just always different. I knew that most of my friends, we all had normal childhoods. We rode bikes, we played sports, and chased girls. We did, everything that everybody did in those days. And but never. We were Saturday people because we were Jews. Everybody else on Sunday went to church. But it was always my mother's family. It was one thing that stood out, except for 2 things. One is that my dad had an uncle in Kansas City, Missouri, that I had met, didn't know about, but he was it. He was the only living relative that my dad had. And he also had a friend in Shorewood, his age, that I knew he grew up with. Wasn't related, but we would spend time with my dad's friend, Sidney, in Shorewood, and his wife. Mysterious to me, no idea why nobody else in the world but this gentleman in Shorewood and an uncle in Kansas City. Let me take you through the story of my father. And as I mentioned, the story of the people that I'm going to talk about, I feel personally it's my story also. I feel, even though I didn't go through it myself, my life has been very impacted by what happened in those days, in those killing fields in Europe. In April of 1945, the Allies had been making tremendous progress in defeating the Axis forces, and they were marching through Germany and liberating concentration camps, and they got to Dachau near Munich. And so the U.S. Army liberated the camp, and that was about 80 years ago, if I use 2025 as the endpoint. What happened that led to that point, that this camp had to be liberated by the largest military force ever assembled? So here's the U.S. or the European continent, and you'll see under the arrow a small country called Lithuania. That's up in the Baltics. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. At the beginning of World War II, that was part of the Soviet Union. And I don't have my pointer with me, but Dachau is located in Germany, right here, southern Germany, Munich. Lithuania, very much like Wisconsin in many ways. Colder climate, lots of forestry, rivers, the body of water, the Baltic Sea nearby, and it had a lot of similarities, to what you think of in Wisconsin. My dad was from a small town called Janova, which was maybe 5,000 people, probably not even that much, probably the size of Watertown. And frankly, the biggest city close to him was a city called Kaunas, which is maybe perhaps the size of Waukesha at that time. It would have been about the size of Waukesha. And Kaunas was a central hub for both the rail lines that went from the Baltic Sea into Russia, and also the main highway, the main thoroughfare through the main paved highway at that time. And so in 1940, my dad was 19 years old. Little different times. He didn't have the internet, didn't have all the modern things that we have now. But he lived the life of a 19-year-old back in the early 1940s. And he played sports, he loved soccer. I mentioned they lived along a river, so they would go swimming. There was, he was involved in his synagogue, and at age 19, he was already in the workforce. So his education stopped at about 8th grade, equivalent to our 8th grade, and then he went to work in those days. And his town, along the rail lines there, was actually known for furniture and cabinet making. So my dad worked in a furniture shop. He became an apprentice carpenter at a very young age. At that time, World War II was underway. The Nazi Germany, Hitler had made a pact with Stalin. And this pact was called the Ribbentrop Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and it was designed to split up spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, so that the Nazis said, we want Poland, and the Soviets said, we're going to hold on to the Baltic states, and this agreement, which blew up in it was signed in 1939 and it blew up in 1940. And Nazi Germany declared war on the Soviet Union and opened up a new front in Eastern Europe and began something called Operation Barbarossa. What then happened was that the Soviets, or the Nazis, very quickly decimated the Soviet army. They took over Poland and they began to come into Lithuania and the Baltic states. And the Soviet army was on the run. They had collapsed and they were on the run. And I mentioned that my dad lived in this small town in an area where there was a highway and a railroad. Well, what happened was that as the Soviet army began to retreat and the Nazis pursued them, they pursued them right through Lithuania, right towards Kaunas and towards where my dad lived. And if you recall, Hitler had a sickness, and that was that he hated the Jews, and he blamed everything on the Jews, and he wanted to annihilate the Jewish population. So wherever they went, wherever the Nazi troops went, they started slaughtering the Jews in their midst. And they also worked with the local population to fire them up to do their dirty deeds at the same time. So all of the people in Lithuania were, particularly the Jewish communities in these smaller towns, who had lived peacefully with their neighbors for many years, were now in a position where they had, it was flight or die, frankly. They were very scared of what would happen to them. So many started to go onto the highways and start fleeing as far away as they could. They wanted to go to the Soviet Union, where the Nazis had not yet, been on the ground. And so what happened was that in roughly the summertime, June of 1941, when the Germans invaded Lithuania, they got to my dad's town of Janova. And at that point in time, people had to decide what to do. And so there was very little time. It happened lightning fast. And before you know it, the Nazi forces were on the outskirts of the town. And a lot of the locals were trying to protect themselves, and they turned against the local Jewish population. And so the Jews started fleeing onto the highway. And at the same time that they fled onto the highway, there was all of these retreating Soviet troops were also on the highway. It was chaos. It was pandemonium. And also at the same time, the German Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, they started flying over the highway, and they had small aircraft, dive bombers almost, that were going after the Soviet forces on the highway. And at the same time, and these dive bombers back in World War II, they were equipped with machine guns. They did have bombs in the fuselage, but for the most part, they were small planes flying close to the ground, equipped with machine guns, and they started strafing people on the highway. My dad and his whole family were on the highway, and when this pandemonium started breaking out, and fear started to overcome everybody, he was separated from his family. And my dad had there were three siblings. He had an older sister and a younger brother. And his younger brother was with him for a little while, along with several of his friends, the younger, stronger people that he was with from his town. And when the highway was being strafed and all of this commotion was taking place and people were fleeing, they went one way, and his parents, he doesn't know what happened to them. He never saw them again. for all intents and purposes, they were killed right then and there, as were many people along the highways. And so he and his friends, along with the rest of the people moving along, were trying to get to Latvia. So they started out here in Janova, and they had to go to Latvia, which was about 100 kilometers to the border. And the Nazis were moving on several fronts, but they hadn't gotten into this area yet. So everybody was heading towards that, and they finally got to a town called Daugavpils, which is in the terminology, in the Yiddish terminology in those days, was known as Dvinsk. So you might hear the word Dvinsk. But Daugavpils was a city in Latvia, which when they got to Daugavpils, the Germans were surrounding the city, but it was they still had been fought off. They were still being fought off by the Latvian forces, and they all made it to a train station. He and a number of people from his local town, with many others, and they were crowding into this train station, trying to get on the train to get into the Soviet Union, to get as far away as they could. And they got about 4 kilometers away, which isn't very far. And Nazi forces came through, stopped the train, and forced everybody out and back to the city of Daugavpils, where they were brought into an old fortress which was used as a prison at that time, and they were basically captured. So in Daugavpils, when he was there, they had roundups in this prison yard. And basically what the Nazis and their collaborators were doing was trying to separate anybody that was useful to them versus people that they considered useless. The elderly, children, infirm, and so they had these separations in the prison yard. And they started killing people. And they had these lineups, and my dad and his best friend, who I mentioned, who ended up in Shorewood, and several of his other compatriots from his town managed to hide in a storage room in the prison, and they made it through 2 or 3 of these what they called selections over a couple of days, and they knew they could tell what was going on. And eventually, it got very quiet, and they decided, let's finally open up everything that they had on top of them: blankets, straw, wood, and they peered through, and it was incredibly quiet. And they realized that they had made it through those early selections. They had stayed alive. What they didn't realize also at that same time is that the Nazis were setting up on the other side. There was a prison, and there was a river, and on the other side of the river there was a big citadel, which was a fortress, an old ancient fortress, and some tenements and older buildings. And they set up a ghetto there, which they did all over Europe. They would set up a ghetto so they could separate the Jews from the regular population. And they were setting up a ghetto, and then the noise started happening again. What was happening is that more people were brought into this prison for this selection and separation. So ultimately, they ended up with everybody else that had anything left to offer health-wise that could be useful to the Nazis. They ended up in this ghetto in this Latvian city of Daugavpils. Conditions there were very bad, very bad. And keep in mind, when an army is fighting, they need a lot of support. They need everything from they need fuel, they need wood, they need to take care of the vehicles, they need clothing, they need uniforms, and so they have a lot of needs. And so the Jews that were young or healthy were put to work the Nazi war effort at that time. They were basically, slave labor. And conditions got really bad, sickness was terrible, and my dad and some of his friends decided to escape. And in that area around Latvia and Belarus, and some of those countries, Belarus was still under Soviet control, it was still free, although the Nazis were moving into Belarus. Many of the people, the Jews that were young, escaped and went into the forests, and they were known as partisans. Partisans were also were part of the Soviet Union, their forces who escaped, and they basically set up ambushes in the forests to ambush German trains, to ambush troops. It was a real thorn in the side of the Nazi war machine. And so there were many people that ended up in the forest. The conditions there weren't, it wasn't an easy life being in the forest for a number of reasons. First of all, it was winter, it was cold. These are, people that probably had very little good clothing, warm clothing. They had been starved by the Nazis, so they weren't in good health. But I think that what drove them was to save their lives. But they were also in an area where there were local farmers and peasants that were antagonistic to the Jews, so they weren't welcome. Plus the other partisan forces that were connected with the Soviets, they were not exactly friendly to the Jewish partisans either. And the Jewish partisans, there were in two groups. There were those who fought, who were able to get weapons, and those that were called family camps, that were just trying to survive, women, children, elderly. And there's a movie out that a few years back, it's called Defiance. Daniel Craig, the actor who also played James Bond, is in it. And it's the story of the Tuvia brothers who led a group of Jewish partisans. It's a phenomenal movie, but it tells their story. There's many books about the situation. So my dad, Sam, was in the forests for several years on the run. And as things progressed, there was something called, there was no communication in those days. Okay, you didn't have, there was nothing. They lived in the forest, and all you did was pick up little bits of information from people who had been moving around. It's called whispering through the trees. And my dad had heard that back in the ghetto in Dvinsk, that the Nazis were in pretty desperate need of workers. And my dad was still healthy. So surprisingly, it's surprising to me as this kid listening to him tell the story, that he actually went back in the ghetto. He snuck into the ghetto that he had snuck out of. And he actually went in and he was assigned to a workforce nearby, just outside the ghetto. So he would get a little permit each day to come in and out. And it was a stable. Remember, horses were very important to transportation, even in the 1940s. And so there was a stable run by several German soldiers. They weren't SS, and my dad worked for one of these German soldiers who was running the stable. He even spoke of him by his name, which was Brindle. And Brindle was, he would call him a good German. And Brindle helped him. He gave him food. He took care of him. And essentially, in some ways, saved his life. But conditions started to worsen. as they did, the need again was to escape, get out, find a way, because what was likely to happen, when I say conditions worsened, it meant that the SS was starting to slaughter people in the ghetto, starting to eliminate people. And so my dad spoke with his good German friend, Brindle, and Brindle said that, and again, hearing that there was, back in Lithuania, there was a community called Šadlė, a city called Šadlė, and the word was that there was a ghetto in Šadlė, and the Nazis had not begun to liquidate that ghetto, and conditions were reasonably good. This is what they're hearing, nobody knew for sure. But there was a train that went from near Daugavpils back into Lithuania to Šadlė. And my dad thought if he could get on that train and get back there, maybe he has a chance of surviving. And so Brindle, the German, helped him sneak onto the train. You don't just walk around, you need, somebody's got to say it's okay for him to get on this train. So my dad was able to get on the train heading towards Šadlė. At the same time, his best friend, the one who ended up in Shorewood, also escaped and ended up in Šadlė too. Their luck was running out there also. After a period of time there, conditions started to get bad and they started to do liquidations. So they planned another escape. This time though, things caught up to them. They were not able to get out, and the Nazis began the liquidation of the ghetto. Many who were able-bodied were put on trains and sent to a place called Stutthof. Stutthof is in Poland. It's better known today as Gdansk in Poland, which you may remember from the late 1980s, 90s, where there was a big uprising against the Soviet Union and communism in Poland. So Stutthof at that time was a Nazi extermination and transit camp. It was a really bad place. You either had the ability to be a slave labor and were useful to the Nazis, or you were going to be killed. My dad, plus his best friend, were put on a train after several difficult days watching people be murdered, and they were sent in a long train ride from Poland into Germany. They were heading to Dachau in southern Germany. So it wasn't, you think about the war's been going on in Europe for several years now. A train ride it's not Amtrak. So essentially, the tracks, many of them were wound down. So many of these kinds of train trips, would take weeks because they would be stopped for days while they were trying to get the tracks functional again. But after several weeks, they ended up in southern Germany in Dachau. So the Dachau Concentration Camp was, they had the concentration camp where there were barracks filled with mostly Jews, but also many others that were unfavorable to the Nazis. And there were also work camps, sub-camps around the area. In fact, if you go to Munich today, you can, there's a memorial there for Dachau. But you can see how Dachau right now, it's a thriving suburb. It's like going to Brookfield. That's what it looks like right now. But in those days, it was the base where they put this camp, mainly for slave labor. And my dad was assigned to a detail. And in and around that area, the Nazis had they had underground factories building airplanes, literally nearby Dachau. They had a lot of munitions factories. there was a lot going on for the military machine in that area. And so my dad was assigned to a work detail where he was building barracks, doing roofing and building barracks. Work was extremely tough, but it was better than being in the camp itself, where you were basically wasting away and dying of starvation. So one day, very much, he was, I won't say he was reaching the end, but he was losing a lot of his strength. And he sees a truck passing him. And on that truck was his best friend from his hometown, going to a different camp. They knew they were both in the same, in Dachau at the same time. The Allied forces were making great strides, as I mentioned at the start of my talk. And, as they were, people could hear the fighter planes overhead. They knew that something was going on. They knew the U.S. was, and the Allies, the British friends were winning. And, but most people were, at that point, were just dying of disease and starvation and, everything that, all of the horrific things, that happened during the war multiplied because, you were targeted for death from the very start. But fortunately, the camps were liberated in 1945. The U.S. forces liberated Dachau. Other camps were like Bergen-Belsen were liberated by the British. But my dad, right at the very end, when he was in Dachau, they marched the prisoners. The guards weren't sure where to go themselves. They weren't sure what was happening, and they didn't want to. They wanted to throw people off, so they started marching everybody around. They were marching in circles around the farm fields and the areas around there. And then one evening, all of the guards just disappeared and left my dad and a number of the workers in a field. In a field in this area, and I don't think they realized it, but they were now free. They were free, but they were they started seeing jeeps and vehicles, U.S. Army vehicles, and my dad recounted the story of how a vehicle of soldiers approached them, and they were all black men, and he had never seen a black person in his life. And they shared. They had some cigarettes and they had some other things that they gave them, and they didn't know what to do with these poor survivors. And the survivors had no idea what to do with these soldiers. But within a very short period of time, there were Red Cross trucks and vehicles coming in. And they realized they were being liberated. And they did, so the war was over. They survived 1,400 days in the grip of terror. Now what do you do with your life? It's been devastated and destroyed. The U.S. soldiers, the U.S. Army actually took over Dachau, and they set up a hospital there. And right after the war, the Allies set up displaced persons camps throughout Europe. Not just for the Jews, but many hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced. And my dad really didn't want to go into a camp. His best friend ended up in one of the camps, displaced person camps. It was tough because the camps were also filled not just with Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, but a lot of people who were Nazi sympathizers, who were collaborators, who were others. You know, at that time there was chaos in Europe, and people were, you know, everybody had an alias, and you know, if you helped Nazi forces in Czechoslovakia or Poland or wherever you were, and the war's over, and you know, you show up at a camp, you're displaced. Also, you know, they're going to let you in the camp. So there was a lot of difficulty being in those camps, and my dad thought, you know, maybe he'd go back and see if he could find any of his family. And so what he started to do that. He started heading towards Poland, and he ran into a group of fellow Jews who were organizing groups of Jewish survivors to help them eventually build a new homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine, which it was called at the time, in the British Mandate of Palestine. And, you know, my dad thought, you know, this camp doesn't make sense for me. He was told, don't go back to Lithuania. You know, you're going to find, if there's anything left of your home, if somebody's going to be living in it, they're going to tell you, get away, go. We don't want you here anymore. There's not going to be any life for you. So my dad joined a group called the Haganah, and we know I don't have a lot of time to get into that particular story, but the Jewish people had been returning to Palestine since about 1880. And in the succeeding years, especially right after the end of World War II, the British controlled Palestine. They had a mandate for Palestine. And they started restricting immigration just when the Jewish people needed it most. They needed a homeland, they needed a place where they could feel safe. So the Haganah, which was a group of Jews based in Israel, set out with people all over Europe, trying to recruit as many of the survivors as they can, bring them to Italy, where they would then help smuggle people into Palestine. So I'm not saying my dad wanted intrigue, but this is where he ended up. He ended up in Italy. He crossed over illegally the Italian border with many other Jewish survivors, and they actually set up convalescent homes and communities in Italy where they could recover their lives, and many did. They built schools. They had. Many had children. They started rebuilding their lives. And my dad worked in Italy, in the port of Naples, helping to smuggle Jews onto ships through the Mediterranean over to Israel. So 1948, Israel becomes a state, independent state, and the Arabs attack. A war commences. My dad was in Italy. He thought, you know, most of the Jews that survived went to Israel, but my dad thought, you know, I've just been through 4 years of war. I don't know that I want to, even though I'd love to go to Israel. I don't know if I'm feeling like I can put up with it, immediately be drafted into the Israeli Defense Forces and go through war. During that time, he got in touch with his uncle in Kansas City, Missouri. His uncle sponsored him to come to the United States. So my dad came to the United States on a U.S. Army transport ship and arrived in 1949 to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, how did he end up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin? So real quick, because we're running out of time. So he actually went to Kansas City first. But he was, his best friend, like he mentioned, mentioning throughout the story, ended up in Milwaukee. And they got in touch with each other. My dad was a carpenter. I think I mentioned that. And so he had heard that things were pretty good in Milwaukee. It was a big union town. He could probably do well for himself. And his best friend was here, so why not come to Milwaukee? So he did. He ended up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And in 1954, he married my mom, Sophie, here in Milwaukee. My mom, real briefly, a quick word about my mom. She was, came from London, England. She was in London during the war. So she lived through the Blitz, the bombing of London by the Nazis. Her family had to escape London and go out to the countryside to survive. She actually joined after the war, she joined the British Army. Her family began to immigrate to the United States through Canada first and then the United States. And so she followed her family over here and met my dad in Milwaukee. And so my parents had two sons, myself and my older brother. And ended up, he worked in Milwaukee for 25, 30 years as a carpenter, cabinet maker, did a lot of remodeling for people, and then ended up retiring in Florida in 1981. So when they were in Florida, my dad got a call from the Shoah Foundation, which was founded by Steven Spielberg, the Hollywood producer, to catalog and video all of the survivors that they could possibly get to. So they sent a crew, a videography crew, down to my parents' condo in Florida and did 4 hours of testimony, video testimony, which is all uploaded now at the University of Southern California, USC, at the Shoah Foundation. And you can find the stories of survivors. They even converted some of those into holographs, so the people that are now deceased can tell you their stories in person. My dad passed away at age 80 in 2001 here in Florida. And I think it's important as I close to talk a little bit about what's happened to Jewish people since World War II. The Jewish population in the world was about 17 million before World War II. And today it's about 15 million. So there are less Jews today than there were before World War II. We still have not recovered population-wise, demographically, from what the Nazis did to the Jewish people. But we have our own state now. Modern state of Israel was founded in 1948. There's about 7 million Jews in Israel, about 6 million in the US, and only about 1.1 million Jews left in Europe today. Dachau is now a museum. But I try to bring things to life. One of the reasons I speak to groups is that it's not just to remember. It's to both honor the survivors because they can't speak for themselves, and it's to never forget that that was my history also, and that it's incumbent on me to tell his story. And so that's why I'm here today and why I appreciate you listening to the story of my dad. In closing, so there was a pastor by the name of Martin Niemöller. So he was a Lutheran pastor in Germany. He actually was he was a very conservative nationalist person who actually joined the Nazi Party in 1933. And until the Nazis decided that they wanted to interfere in church policy, And what they did was that they said, okay, you know, Jesus is no longer a Jew, he's an Aryan. You know, there are converts in your congregations who are Jewish. They can't be accepted. This is not acceptable to the Nazi Party. And he revolted against that. He stood up to the Nazis, and he ended up in Dachau. He survived, but he ended up in Dachau, which is kind of interesting because they had no use for him, you know, when he decided to dissent. But anyhow, he wrote some confessionals after the war, and this is one where he was talking about, you know, a lot of the people he didn't like. He didn't like the unions. He didn't like the communists. He didn't like the Jews and all this other stuff. But the Nazis kept coming for them, and eventually they came for him. And he said, you know, in a confessional, you know, why didn't we speak up? Why didn't we speak up? So the message and the moral is to, you know, do not be a bystander. And with all the hate in the world and all of the anti-Semitism we're seeing now, it's important that we not let this pass, and we not let this become normalized. So I want to thank you very much for your time and for listening to my story.
It's hard for me to imagine that one person could endure physically what your father endured and survived. Was he left with any lasting physical challenges or even psychological?
Yeah, very much so. My dad was.
Can you repeat the question?
Repeat, yes.
Was asked whether, because of the difficulties of surviving and all the horrors my dad went through, what condition was he like? You know, was he physically or mentally, you know, battered by all of this? And the answer to that is yes. He was very much a broken man in many ways. Very much a broken man. It's very difficult for him. Physically, he was. It wasn't so bad, but you know, he was young at the time. Physically he had some problems, but it was mostly psychological. When my dad looked in the mirror, he didn't see, you know, a free American citizen that had a good job and a good family. He saw a refugee, and he would hoard things, terrible hoarding. You know, no restaurant in Milwaukee area had any salt and pepper packets left after my dad got. But no, seriously, he was very much psychologically impacted by it, which makes marriage difficult too, by the way. So absolutely.
Yeah, you mentioned that he spent a long time in the forest, and he must have been very adept at living off the land. I just can't imagine how you get food, and you must be able to forage for other people to survive. So, did he get food from anybody else, or did he just live off the land?
Yeah, they would get food off of local peasant farmers. Often it was never enough, and what made that somewhat possible, obviously, you know, some people were generous with you know, but what made it possible is that there were dead bodies everywhere, soldiers and everything. So they would steal the weapons if they could. That was first and foremost. They would take the clothing, the coats, anything of value, and they would use those as in trade with local farmers or anybody that they could to get food, basically. That was mainly their way of surviving.
Have you had the opportunity to get over to Dachau?
I was in Dachau. Yeah, I was in Dachau on a trip to Europe. Not for that purpose, but we did go to Dachau, and it was I was with my wife and father-in-law, and my father-in-law worked for a company that had a plant in Munich, and so we stayed with some people there, and I went to Dachau.
I remember reading that a lot of Jewish social service agencies didn't believe the survivors of the Holocaust. They thought it was just ridiculous. Not ridiculous, but not true. Did that happen with your father?
Yeah. Well, there was, you know, people were incredulous. They couldn't believe these stories. You know, whether it was, I mean, our government knew. Everybody, you know, people in power knew, but the stories were unbelievable. The Jewish diaspora in the United States, you know, were very well aware of what was going on. And they were trying to get the U.S. government to do things like bomb the train, rail lines, you know, somehow interdict. But there was war strategy and war issues, and can't get into all that. But you know, it was decided that they had to defeat the Nazis, and there were other ways to do that. And so. But many people were shocked at, they heard the stories, but they were shocked at the extent of the killing and the systemic nature of it. Nobody really grasped that. And in fact, the soldiers that liberated, there's a story about, I don't know if it was Eisenhower, but one of the generals forced the locals from those areas, the local population, to go, whether it was Bergen-Belsen, it was Eisenhower, and said, you know, well, you're going to see what happened here, and there was documentation of the camps. You know, the Nazis were great at keeping records too, by the way. So over many years, much of the stories were there was enough evidence. You're not sure in case anybody doubted what happened.
Several years ago, we took a bus tour to Germany, but we stopped at Dachau. And one thing that struck me there was all of the school buses in the parking lot. I mean, I think it's a requirement in Germany that every child visits a concentration camp or something, but it was, that struck me.
Yeah, the German government today takes very seriously their responsibility for what happened to the Jewish people. Mind you, here in the United States, so in Wisconsin passed a state law 2 years ago requiring Holocaust education in middle schools and high schools in Wisconsin. And the Speakers Bureau I'm part of goes and speaks to high school, and actually as young as 8th graders, 7th graders even, about the Holocaust here. So, yeah.
This is not really a question, it's more of a comment. My father was a major in the Army, and he was a nutritionist. He had a PhD from Cornell. He was assigned to the Army Nutrition Corps, and his job was working to calculate refeeding requirements for Holocaust survivors in southern Germany. So I grew up always seeing the little tiny pictures of dead bodies and asking my father what they were, and he would tell me about Dachau and some other camps. And this is not unusual. He said that they had a lot of problems because when they tried to refeed survivors, they calculated a very, very small watery broth to get them gradually to be able to take more food in. And they had a lot of problems with US soldiers throwing candy bars and chocolate and killing people. Mm-hmm. He said that as many people died after liberation as, not as many, but many, many people died because they couldn't stand the idea that people like my father were insisting that they be refed very slowly.
Yeah, very, I've read a little bit about that myself, and you know, I mentioned that the soldiers just, they felt like they wanted to give these people something, you know, so they gave them what they had, and you know, they got sick instantly from whatever was given to them.
As you were speaking, particularly in the beginning, how this happened, I couldn't help but draw a parallel in my own mind about the danger I see in our country. Yes. 11 million undocumented human beings, either kicking them out in Parliament or putting them in camps so they can figure out what they're going to do with them. And I'm just wondering if you have any thought like that, and what do we do?
You know, let me share with you something that somebody asked me that question recently, you know, my dad was a refugee. He came to the U.S. legally, you know, I think that migration is a double-edged sword. So you've got to have the population has to accept migrants coming there. It's better if you come in legally than if you come in illegally. However, you know, I think what's happening in Europe is somewhat driving what's going on here now. So in 2015, and after the civil war in Syria, and the Arab Spring, which fell apart, millions of illegal Muslim migrants came into Europe. And in Eastern Europe, or in Western Europe, they were welcomed in. Come in, come in, come in, come in, come in. In Eastern Europe, they said, no, we're closing the border. Fast forward to today, there in Western Europe, in Great Britain, France, Germany, Amsterdam, there's massive unrest in all those areas because so many Muslim migrants came in that didn't assimilate, there was no common language, there was no common religion, there was no cultural affinity, and there's significant problems in Eastern Europe where they didn't allow the immigration. I don't want to say it's idyllic and beautiful or anything like that, but they have none of the civil strife or anything else. And so what we're dealing with in terms of acceptance of migrants is, we're seeing this play out in Europe, and people are worried about it playing out here also. And we've got it's not a good thing when borders are not open like that. And now we got a real serious problem here. So we have to find a way to accept people and bring them in. But we have it's a real serious problem right now. And I feel it, my dad was he both crossed borders illegally and he came in legally. And, I wish I could turn back the clock, and we found a better way several years ago to deal with our borders. Now it's something where we got major problems.
Andy, thank you for your story. I saw Bonhoeffer, the movie Bonhoeffer is now playing. And I encourage people to go to it, but to be aware that it's controversial. But it really deals with what was going on in Germany at that time. And I was going to ask you to read the quote that you have up there about First They Came. Can you pull that up to read that?
What was the name of the movie?
Bonhoeffer.
Is that the name of the minister?
Bonhoeffer.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just called Bonhoeffer. And it's controversial, but I think in terms of what's happening in our country right now.
I'm sorry, I stopped you sharing.
Oh, sure. Okay, sorry, I already stopped sharing.
Okay, all right, well, I encourage people to really look at that poem, First They Came. You have it posted, it's a beautiful poem.
Yeah.
How do you spell that? Bonhoeffer.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy.